Great. So, welcome everyone. On behalf of Kucharya, welcome to this wonderful session as a part of Awake, Aware, Arise conference. My name is Ujjwal, and I am happy to be hosting a wonderful panel today. And by the time you are joining and settling down, as some of you have already done it, so please share where are you joining us from, and very warm welcome to everyone. I'm not saying good morning or good evening or good afternoon because all of us are joining from different time zones. And it's absolute pleasure for me to introduce Andrew and his panel today. But Andrew would be more than happy to introduce his colleagues. But I am delighted to say a bit about Andrew. Andrew has been, he used to be an attorney, and from a legal profession, he moved into leadership development. And more than 20 years now, he has been one of the most sought after leadership counselors, coach, and also somebody who embeds spirituality as a way of leadership development. He feels that awareness is a foundational stone of anybody to grow in life. And he has some of the best of the clients that he has, but he's very humble about it. If you go on his website, which is Lighthouse Consulting, you won't find much of a showdown there, but you will find some of real authentic stuff there. So not coming between you and Andrew. And over to you, Andrew. I'm happy to be hosting you today and your team. Thank you for accepting the invitation to come on this panel today.
Of course. Thank you. And thank you for helping us and supporting us in many ways. In some ways we don't even know yet, so thank you in advance.
Most welcome.
I want to welcome my two colleagues and friends who will be bringing this topic to life. The first is Angela Errol. Angela, you're showing up as me and your name on the box. So if you're able to change that, great. Otherwise, well, we work together a lot, so no one confuses us though typically. So Angela, my dear friend and colleague Angela, is a world-class executive coach. She also has made a shift from the corporate world into supporting the corporate world as an external executive coach. She brings 30 years of executive coaching experience across many industries. She's designed and led coaching academies and leadership academies for the Center for Creative Leadership, Duke Medicine, Johnson & Johnson, Girl Scouts USA. She's been a chief learning officer, chief diversity officer. I have to read because it's too much to remember. She's hired and managed coaches. And then, and perhaps more importantly, in my values, Angela is also a mystic, a priestess, a minister, an interfaith minister, a member of Agape Global Ministries. And she works as a business coach, spiritual coach, social justice activist to address structural, institutional, and systemic racism and culture change, and to help leaders find purpose. Yeah, and Angela, what can I say about Angela? She walks her talk. She's a dear friend. She's one of the most authentic and prolific people I know, and I'm grateful to be with you as always. And Barney Singer, counselor, a fellow lawyer, a fellow recovering lawyer. So thanks for being with us. Barney is a social change leader with more than 35 years of multidisciplinary experience. He currently serves as a director of leadership and capacity development programs for FHI 360, an international nonprofit organization. And until recently, I think was headquartered in DC, but now in Durham, North Carolina, so still US based. But Barney spends a lot of his time, maybe not this year, but a lot of his time overseas, particularly in Africa, as I understand, Barney, right? Primarily?
Yes, that's correct.
Which perhaps is where that spectacular photograph comes from. So thank you for sharing that as well. Barney's a coach, facilitator, and trainer around the world, oversees a $300 million portfolio of leadership and capacity development initiatives that have empowered civil society leaders in 55 countries. And he brings a lot of academic experience as well. He has been adjunct faculty at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs, teaching a graduate level course on civil society and development. He has served as faculty on Insight University, teaching law and ethics in leadership. And in 2017, He helped develop the program and design a course at the Peace Theological Seminary and College of Philosophy in their Transcendent Leadership Program, a course called The Spirit of the Law, and a second course, Expressing Transcendent Leadership Through Myth and Story. So there's a lot to work with here, but alas, we only have 90 minutes. So as we talked about this, the three of us, about how we would set this up, we thought that we might divide this time into 4 questions that we might address, and then we would want to leave some time for Q&A. So Mutual, if we haven't stopped talking by the top of the hour, we want to try to preserve as much of 30 full minutes for Q&A as we can. So give me the high sign if we get on a roll and I lose track of time.
Sure,
So,
no problem, Andrew. And just wanted to ensure that you have hit the live broadcast button, and we are live on YouTube.
So is there something I need to do, or are we okay?
Do you see that button, live broadcast button on your screen?
It looks to me like it's flashing as if we are recording already.
Oh, great. Wonderful. All right. All right. Great.
Good.
Let's move forward. Yeah.
Okay. Well, in order to move forward, let's move inward. So let's do this first. Great. Okay, so we start with that full stop, which is just one tradition as a way of centering, a way of getting here. I think it's important we did that first, and now we can identify it, because I think experience precedes knowledge. So I'm glad that we can do that first as a way of getting here. So as I mentioned, we'll divide this discussion into 4 questions. I don't know if that's a Jewish thing, Barney. We could check in on that later, but well, it's 4 questions. The first one of which, very importantly, is what do we mean by spirituality? Because we want to be sure to set our context here. We're not out of our lanes, and we're clear about what we're talking about. So I would bring two models here into play. The first one primarily is this model that's adapted from Drs. Ron and Mary Hulnick at the University of Santa Monica. So this is their model. This is just my way of explaining it a bit. So typically we operate on the physical level. What's happening to us? Are we working? What's our role? What's happening in the physical space? Things we can touch, etc. Physical level, we get it. The mental level, our thoughts. The emotional level, our feelings. And below is the self and spiritual level. And we'll talk about all these in more depth. You might call the mental and emotional level the ego. I do have a master's in psychology, but I'm not going to debate what the ego is and what it isn't. We're on the wrong bus for that. So let's look at each one of these. Physical level might be what's happening with our fitness and our bodies, primarily. What's happening on the wealth level, what's happening on our work level, etc. Mental level is a place where we've got positive thoughts, we've got clarity, hopefully. Emotional level, happiness, joy, sadness, whatever. It's at the self and spiritual level, below the surface, within us, within each of us, I would assert. That's the place of loving and acceptance. In fact, I even have to start talking more slowly when I talk about that level, because it's more grounded. That's the place of inner peace. It's the place where we can forgive. It's a place of altruism and a service consciousness. I'm not here to define what spiritual means. My intention is to suggest some way we can frame this so that we can have a conversation. We're not all going to agree on what definitions are. But what I would say is, although it is an opinion for me to speak about this like this, there is some research absolutely to suggest that we are hardwired for spiritual experiences. So I'm referring now to the work of Andrew Newman and Eugene de Quilly, who wrote a few books 20 years ago. One was called Why God Won't Go Away, where the research was essentially tracing the heart and brain waves of monks who were meditating. And they reached a state of brainwave frequency that was not measured at that level before. We are wired to respond to spiritual experience. What that means for one of us may be different than what it means for the other. Let's just leave it at that for now. So fine, basic definition. When we look a little bit deeper, now we see that there's a plus and a minus. There's a positive and a negative polarity to the physical level, right? We can have fitness and wealth. We can have illness and poverty. On the positive side of mental, we could have positive thinking and clarity. On the negative side, on the negative side, we can negative thinking. We can have judgment. We could have separation. We could have frustration, confusion, chaos. I can be familiar with that at times. On the emotional dimension, on the positive side, happiness, of course. On the negative side, there's sadness and anger. There's a plus and a minus. There's a positive and negative experience that we have as human beings on those three levels. At the self level, or the spiritual level, if you prefer to call it that, there is no duality. There is no plus and minus. It just is. What that means from a personal functional level, as far as I'm concerned, is it means that level is available to us. So if we need inner peace, or we need to enter a state of forgiveness, or we're feeling like stuck on a negative level up above, we can take a big ladle and deep down into that spiritual level and bring it up. So that may be as simple as, I'm feeling overwhelmed, I need to take a walk. I'm feeling frustrated or angry or something, and I need to meditate. I need to go for a run, like some of my clients love to do. Or I need to pray, or I need to do some kind of mindfulness activity, whatever that is. That level is available to us. And in the context of what we're talking about here, the level is available to us so that we can be better equipped to attend to the needs of others and serve the needs of others. And that's what this conference is all about. It's not necessarily about psychology. It's about centering so that we can serve from the inside out. So I would go quickly to another model that was developed by the Oxford Leadership Group, does wonderful coaching and consulting work around the world. So note the British spelling on some of the slides. That's where that comes from. So leadership from the inside out, and it begins at the bottom at the individual level. So from leading self to leading others, to then leading the organizational culture, to then building community, as some of the other sessions in this conference have talked about wonderfully, about how this is about community and about changing society and arising to address the needs of society. We can't build community if the self is weak or crumbled or unsupported. We can't lead teams similarly if we're not present and strong enough to do that. So that's what I would say as to what spirituality means and why we're talking about it, which is what this slide is about. So, Angela, your thoughts about that first question? And let me know if you want me to refer back to a different slide.
Actually, I'm pleased with the slides you presented, and the power of the slides come through for me. The essence of spirituality that I most enjoy talking about is what you mentioned as the inside. And so that's where I believe there's a constant intelligence and a spiritual intelligence that has power within every human being to magnify the self. And that's the first level, or maybe the last level that you described, but it's the cornerstone of the magnetism. And once the self is acknowledged and activated, it's constantly available in service of the other three levels. And so, quite like you said, by having mastery at the self level, we're able to have more of the emotional, mental, and physical levels personified. I'm always in awe of this conversation and all the dimensions that it brings. And one of the threads that goes as a constant through this conversation for me has been a very powerful beginning that I had with the world-renowned Frances Hesselbein, who is now 104 years old, but when she was 96, I met her as the founder and chairman of Leader to Leader, an organization and think tank that does consulting with leaders. And she shared with us that the core spiritual principle that shines a light on all wisdom is that values determine our motives, and motives determine our thoughts, and thoughts determine our actions, and actions determine our outcomes. And so the net is that life is a mirror of self, and the deepest core of who we are that shines a light to allow the other levels that you described, Andrew, to really be a reflection of who we truly are. And so the ultimate core and origin of self informs our attributes. It inspires our emotional level of inner sensitivity, and it equips us to manifest greatness at the physical level. So I'm glad that that is where we're starting. I have more to say about the Oxford model that you shared, and maybe Barney will come back to that.
Barney,
Thank you so much,
I suspect you have
Angela.
something to add here.
I do. Well, thank you to both Angela and Andrew. I want to build on the University of Santa Monica model and comments that Andrew made, and also something that Angela just said about how our self-mastery ultimately can lead to results in the physical. When I think about the four-line model that Andrew presented, one of the things that I'm also aware of is that, as important as we know that the self and the spiritual is the key, our coaching clients are showing up as whole beings with all of those levels. And in fact, they may come to us presenting what they are experiencing as a physical challenge. For example, in a business context, a client may show up saying that they are having trouble meeting a sales target, let's say, or leading a particular team, a very physical level reality that they're facing. But we as coaches have to embrace the whole person. That's the opportunity for us. And part of that means helping them appreciate the relationship among all of those levels. I'd like to actually share another way of looking at the levels that Andrew showed us. Andrew, could you put up the slide that I sent?
I can indeed.
Thank you.
Yes, just give me one moment, please.
Sure. So what Andrew is going to show us on the screen in a moment is another way of looking at the physical, emotional, mental, and spiritual levels. This is also adapted from the work of Drs. Ron and Mary Hulnick at the University of Santa Monica. And what it shows is two axes, a horizontal axis called the goal line, and a vertical axis called the spiritual line or the soul line. And you could think about the horizontal axis, the goal line, as what a client may show up asking for help with, the physical level challenge that they think they are experiencing as the most important, achievement that they want. And we may, in fact, be able to help them to make some progress on the goal line. We also are aware that it's the soul line that is the one that speaks to the spirit or the mastery of self that Angela mentioned. And it is our opportunity to elevate in consciousness for ourselves and invite that forward in our clients. That is really the key opportunity for us. And the trend line that's moving up and to the right is intended to depict the possibility that when we are going up in consciousness, when we are going up into the spiritual, we also have the opportunity to move up in terms of the goal line and the achievements on the physical level. So while we could do either individually, it's the elevation into the spiritual that is actually going to allow us to move even further along the goal line. And so I'm very conscious of that when working with others, whether it's individual clients or teams, because you can only get so far if you're focused on the negative levels that Andrew mentioned. And so when I think of how to define the spiritual, it's thinking about the soul line and evolution. Thanks, Andrew.
Angela, any thoughts about this diagram? Maybe you don't, but something tells me you might. Can't hear you. You're muted. You're muted. You're still muted. You're muted. Well, hold on. So you were unmuted and then immediately, there you go. Stay there.
I am here. Thank you. I'm sorry. I was actually thanking you, Barney, for sharing this model. It reminds me of the goal line and where we are trying to go with our clients and where we have to go with them for that leadership from the inside out experience that Andrew shared in his second slide. So, Andrew, I know for the audience you might think, well, they're going from model to model and they all really do interrelate, much like our consciousness. So, can we see the Oxford model once again, please?
Yes. Let me just try to.
Coaching leaders to have a lived experience from the inside out can really serve as the container for what Barney is saying, having that lived experience, but tapping into the natural gifts that can be explored is where potential is really realized. And so coaches can help amplify spiritual consciousness of clients when they start with self. And I often see the journey as an inward, downward, upward, outward spiral, similar to what Barney talked about of getting to the goal line. I see it as a spiral. And often in coaching, our joy is to heal and restore the spirit and help clients open up the possibilities of finding that soul line, finding that inner core. And if we can help them develop a container and access that purpose, their values, and their vision, that part of accessing their spirit and speaking to that at this stage in their career can help them really find their calling, find their destiny. It's beyond profits. It's really learning to deepen their intuition so that soul line can be personified and that it serves as an anchor and a sense of direction. So I'm glad that we started with the models, and it does have a lot of interplay, so to speak. I believe that where calling comes from can be a past life connection, and sometimes that soul line is there because we're pushed into our calling, or sometimes we are pulled into it. And this push or pull concept is an energetic vibration in and of itself that we can use in coaching when we help access that inside out. So I think this is compelling because we can really help this become a resounding call to leaders to find their legacy, to discover more of who they are, to tap that spiritual core that Barney spoke about. And so I see it as also, we're talking about directions and spirals and lines, but it's also the birthing process. It's really helping the old to die in, or to sublimate that ego, and helping the new to be reborn when we're coaching, and allowing spirit to help access the inner mind, that soul line, that birthing process of where we want to help take our clients. So I see all of the models, and I hope you do in the audience see the interplay of them, and we'll be able to use it in your practice.
Mhm. Beautiful. Well, you are leading us as usual. You're leading us into our next question. Very importantly, which is, what's the connection between spirituality and leadership? You've already spoken to some of that. And what do leaders need from this dimension? And these two connected questions, these are, this is juicy stuff, of course. So I would first suggest, and maybe just by way of context, I believe that this is more relevant now than it's ever been in the past. I think that's because leadership is much more complicated now than it's been in the past. It's much more about engagement now and it's much more about ask and include and engage and less about tell and direct and manage. And I think that we know that, and as coaches, we know that. If we work in the business space, we know that. And I think that team members are wanting more meaning from work than they've wanted before, which means that leaders need to be able to show up in a way that they can demonstrate that and they can resonate with that. We're working in a world, people are working in a world where there's increased appropriately attention and awareness related to discrimination and racism and sexism and classism. People need to belong. They need to have that sense of belonging at work, perhaps more than they needed to in the past. Leaders need to be able to hold space for that. And we can't do that. We can't show up as leaders that way if we don't have that solid foundation ourselves. So I would just start by saying that just that context of leadership has changed and a stronger internal foundation is needed. Whether one chooses to call it spirituality or not is fine with me. I'm not litigating anymore. I don't need to argue with you about words. The important thing is just the practical reality of being real and present for your people as is needed right now. So just a few examples of that. Actually, you know what? I'm going to hold on those examples and I'm going to ask Angela to continue on this theme of the connection and what you think, excuse me, what you think leaders need and maybe why.
As you were sharing this about the connection, Andrew, I want us to be mindful that as we're speaking about helping to connect leaders to who they are and how they lead, whether they're under stress or ready to take action or to be more empathetic or to have more clarity, I want us to be reminded that it starts with us. So the three of us don't take this lightly, that this work starts with self. And so, for example, the connection starts with you as the coach. And I always like to think about, so the times that I have been coached and now that I am coaching and in service of others, I can't help authentically help a client manage this pandemic, for example, unless I know I've managed it for myself. That's the connection that I need to make, because I can't help a leader to authentically brand his organization or her organization unless I've managed my own brand with radical vulnerability. And very often I'm asked about how an organization should respond to, for example, Black Lives Matter. I can't help an organization address Black Lives Matter unless I understand what it means in my own life. And so the extent to which I can become more agile or innovative or break through my own growing edges, then I as a coach can help others become more agile and innovative and break through to have that transformation. So the connections that we're making is not just about looking at the leader that we're coaching, but we also subscribe to this as looking at ourselves. And so I'll start and stop there for the connection, and then maybe I'll come back about how these are connected with some more tangible evidence.
Mm-hmm. Barney.
Thanks, Andrew and Angela. I have so much to share on this. This is such an important question. And I was jotting down some notes, so excuse me if I seem to be looking away. It's just because there were some real nuggets of gold in what Angela and Andrew shared. And I want to start with a point that Angela ended with, which is that the coaching relationship is not one directional. If it is, we are missing a huge opportunity. it is most effective when we are both offering to and learning from our clients. And that, I believe, enriches the entire experience. And that's not something that we should lose. I also want to comment about a couple of things that Andrew said about changes at the moment and what's happening in terms of individual search for meaning. I find that something is shifting all around us at the moment, and there seems to be a lot of change happening in the planet and in the energies that we are experiencing. And part of what I'm experiencing myself seems to be a generational shift. The younger people that I interact with seem to have come into this lifetime with much more of what we're describing than my generation did. They have an innate understanding and ability to embrace the concepts that we're talking about, which is incredibly important, I think, in terms of the trajectory that we are all on and how we can coach others, because there's a receptivity in terms of the younger people that I had not seen before. And so when it comes to that question of internal foundation, I think over time, we're going to see that sort of magnified and amplified out. And those are really wonderful changes. And all of that, predated, in my experience, the pandemic. And I think the pandemic is also part of the energetic shift of the moment. And I don't know yet fully how that's going to affect what we do as coaches, and even in terms of our self-mastery, it's pulling us into different directions, and there's a lot there, I think, that we need to look at. But turning to the specific question, Andrew, that you posed about the connection between spirituality and leadership, what comes forward for me is that the connection is about the possibilities. It's what spirituality brings to leadership and allows us to bring forward. When I think back to what I studied in graduate school and elsewhere, most of the books and the MBA programs and similar experiences of the last 20 years always talked about what a leader should do, how they could or should take certain actions to increase production or, increase sales or, motivate performance.
Lead from a checklist.
Yes, well, yeah, that's exactly right. And, what is so important about this conference and what Ram has brought forward for us is the opportunity, and I believe that this is also borne out in the literature, that leaders who lead from their own spiritual core, as Angela was mentioning before, those are the ones who are the most effective, because we are demonstrating the kind of authenticity that people respond to. And that's what is most effective in leading others. So the question in my mind isn't what can leaders do to be more effective? It's who can the leader be to be more effective? And it's the beingness of leadership that I think makes the most difference. So once you have the self-mastery, as Angela said, that's what brings forward the results and the inspiration and the achievement that others are looking for, for our support in. So as coaches, I think this is how we can most be of service to others, helping them to tap into and to understand and embrace that spiritual dimension of who they are, which, as I said a moment ago, it's sort of like the beingness of leadership. And somebody just put in the chat something that I 100% agree with: more being and less doing. Thank you, Gustavo, for that phraseology. Right on. Thanks.
Yeah, and we're moving along here. I'm checking the clock. We'll be talking about some specific techniques and ways of doing this. And although I have to just plug here that I was recently reminded of the importance of a to-be list for leaders, not just a to-do list. So when we complete a coaching session, what's on my to-be list, if you will. Okay, question 3. I'm going to nudge us forward a little bit here just to stay on course. Forgive me as I'm figuring out how to navigate this. How have we witnessed this connection between spirituality and leadership, and what are some tangible ways to make the connection? So a few slides that I would tee up here, very basically to talk about some very basic things. And again, I'm not suggesting this in any way that's intended to be prescriptive, but rather just some connections. So one would be prayer. So from a place of prayer and from the experience of prayer, not thinking about it, but from the experience of prayer in whatever form that might take. And I had a client once who said, for me, prayer is surfing. And who am I to argue if it brings them to that place? Although I hope they don't get eaten, but that's a separate thing. So from prayer comes humility. And from humility, we can move more easily, and leaders can move more easily into a learner mindset or growth mindset. We are not as attached to our thoughts, to our ways. We don't think we control the universe, because we've just been in an experience that demonstrates that connection with the universe in a different, more balanced type of way. Similarly, meditation, in whatever form that might take, clears our mind, brings us present. We can think more clearly. From a leadership point of view, that means we can make better decisions. Our biases will be reduced. This is well researched. I work at the Wharton School here in Philadelphia, coach MBAs and executives who come to executive MBA programs. We often talk about the research we've done through Wharton about the impact of 20 minutes of mindfulness meditation for 2 weeks reduces bias in decision-making. And I think we know this intuitively because meditation or practices similar to it, and again, I don't care what the label is, brings us present. If we're present, we're not so impacted by what we've done before. We're not so worried about what's coming later. We're here. We can look at the information in front of us. And doesn't the world need leaders that can look at the world in front of us and make the decisions that need to be made? I think about, for example, the work of Kiran Bedi in the Delhi Police Department in India. And I had the good fortune of meeting her some years ago when she released a documentary film about the work that was done to take the Delhi Police Department to a 10-day Vipassana meditation. And her thinking was, and this was played out in the research afterwards, if we can't police ourselves, how are we going to police anybody else? If we're reactive, if we're stressed. And I don't even know what it's like to direct traffic in the streets of Delhi. I can only imagine. But if we're not in a place of center, how can we police others, basically? And that's what we're charged to do. It's a very important responsibility. A few other quick points. Nurturing practice, in whatever form that might take. It could be a walk in nature. It could be picking up a baby. It could be listening to music. It could be service work or caring for others or caring for elders. It evokes a state of empathy. It connects us to our hearts. And if we're in that place, we can listen better. We can demonstrate emotional intelligence more effectively. And we've all seen all the research about emotional intelligence and leadership. It's that service place. One of my favorite quotes about, I think about leadership is from the poet W.H. Auden, who said, "We are all here on earth to help others. What the others are here for, I don't know." I think that's a wonderful quote. And finally, the last one I would have for on this type of model, or actually two more, mindfulness. So any type of meditation or relaxation in this way of mindfulness, or perhaps what Ram refers to as mindlessness, when we get out of our head, the monkey mind of our head, our stress is reduced. When our stress is reduced, we're more resilient. And I would suggest to you that it's pretty clear that in a time of a pandemic, we need leaders who are resilient, who have energy, who can bounce back, who are not reactive, but who are responsive. And finally, perhaps the granddaddy of practices here is whatever gets us to a state of acceptance. Acceptance is the first law of spirit in many traditions. And when we accept what's happening, which does not mean resignation, it means acceptance of what is happening. So, for example, I worked with a team at a big IT company in Silicon Valley. The leader of the team was CEO -2, and that team had its whole structure and focus blown up by the decision of the CEO to do a spin-in, a technology spin-in, and basically change their whole working world. These people were, in their own words, victimized by this leadership decision. And you can make an argument that they were victims of this decision. But as long as they were in the mindset of a victim, they couldn't take clear action. They couldn't see a clear path forward. So they needed to get to a place of acceptance, and I actually supported them with a group session or two about that. When we can let that go and accept what's happening, we can be prepared to take action and then be proactive protagonists, and rather than reactive and stuck in resistance or not accepting. So I would tee those up as examples and then go back to the question for Angela, your thoughts?
And the question is about the connections.
Yes, and tangible ways to make it. Yes, so please talk about ways and your experience.
You know, where attention goes, energy flows, and Andrew and Barney have now taken me to so many different places that I want to respond to. But certainly our intention to leave our ego at the door and to have a clear mind and clear intention and a quiet place to work. And so right now we may not be visiting offices of our coachees, but to what extent can we create that quiet place to be when we are with them on a Zoom meeting? And so I think about, so what is the translation if we were going into offices now? And to what extent do we help people just look at the clutter in the office or the lack of intimacy? Oftentimes my clients are asking me, so how do I organize my office and create that intimacy, similar to an open door policy that you would want to have at work? And many people talk about, oh yes, I have an open door policy, and you coach and with them and you realize that the door might be open, but their heart is not. And so are we looking for those places where we can help them take a look in the mirror just to be in touch with who they are and how they are leading? One of the first things that I do in terms of just making it really tangible is to pray and give gratitude for the people that I've been sent to coach. I don't believe that there's an accident. The very things that they are learning, I am here also to learn. So I lean into the feelings of not avoiding tragedy and not avoiding grieving. And right now with the pandemic, there is such a sense of loss. And so to have conversations and coaching meetings without addressing some of the grief that has taken place in their lives, maybe they haven't lost anyone or been to a Zoom funeral, of which there are many nowadays, but perhaps we can just address some of the grief in their life, bring more humanity to the conversation rather than just diving into the agenda for that day. Andrew mentioned some powerful thoughts about nature, and it takes me to how nature is such a metaphor for spirit and spirituality and coaching. And so just as an example of how I've used it in the past, I live near a labyrinth, and I use that labyrinth in coaching people, leaders that are near me, and encourage those that might be abroad, if I'm coaching abroad, to find a labyrinth. And it is the equivalent of going inside of your soul and leaving something in the middle of that labyrinth and then bringing out something different. And I was coaching an academic dean, to use this as an example of nature. And he walked into the labyrinth several times and just said, you know, my spirit doesn't feel like this is what I want to be doing in life. I'm tired of academia. And I said, well, let's go into the labyrinth. And as you walk out of the labyrinth, let's find that place of where you really want to be more alive in your spirit. And after several walks around the labyrinth, he came out and he said, the legacy that I want to leave in life is to help people laugh. And I'm not doing that now. And fast forward, his story is that he actually ended up moving to a very spiritual place in Sedona and became a dance teacher. And so, and he's very happy and alive in doing more of what he has grown into his purpose. Another client I took into the forest and said, I want you to pick a tree that best represents who you are inside of, he was a medical chair, inside of this organization that you're healing people. And of all the trees that are tall and wide and magnified, he chose a very small bush. And I said, so how is it that we can help you blossom into all these other trees that bring your voice out and to bring who you really are out into the world of this medical institution? He ended up becoming a CEO of a startup, just looking at nature. So those are some examples that I have seen work very well with nature. Also, the use of ceremony. Right before the pandemic, it was early March, and I was working with a client that really wanted to deepen the trust on a team. And as a wedding officiant, sometimes I have my couples and families do a sand ceremony when they're actually mixing sand to personify two different people coming together. And so using this with the team, they each began to pour sand into each other's cups, 12 of them, and left there with affirmations about how they were going to be more trusting and more giving of themselves in their new reality of being a high performing team. And out of this, all of a sudden, the pandemic hits and they're separated and they're apart. But what they do have is a remembrance and a symbol on their bookcase of the sand vessel that each of them took. So I'm never thinking that this is an accident. I might be thinking, you're really going to use a wedding ceremony ritual in a team building? And yes, they do work because we're really accessing more of the humanity and allowing them to heal, sometimes heal their traumas, do their grieving, and come together as something bigger and better where wisdom can be held just through the connection of spirituality and leadership, as well as spirituality and teaming. And so there are never too few examples just around us to access that leadership using our connection with nature as a metaphor. So certainly what Andrew mentioned in meditation and quieting that spirit, we have also, Andrew and I do quite a bit of work together. I've used drumming and music and waterfalls and blindfoldedness to really get into our soul with others, and all kinds of wonderful ways that you can silence the ego and silence the distractions and allow the leader to really access more of who they really are.
Beautiful. Thank you. Barney, some ways you've witnessed and some tangible ways?
Thanks, Andrew and Angela. I'm not going to have time to share everything that has come forward for me, so let me pull out a few key things. One has to do with aliveness of spirit. And Andrew, I'm thinking back to one of your early slides, the first 4-line model. And in the bottom line of self or spirits, one of the things that you mentioned in there was joy. And Angela picked up on this point in one of her examples, where a client was no longer feeling joy in something that he had been doing for many years, which is not at all uncommon for any of us. Mm-hmm. And I think that point about aliveness and what brings someone joy and what evokes that passion inside. That's the sense of purpose that was referred to and that Gustavo wrote about in his chat message. That's so important because not every client that we meet is going to stay in the same organization necessarily. And that's okay. That's a good thing. Our job is to open the possibilities. And so be alert and attuned to what brings someone else's spirit alive, parenthetically, as well as our own. Completely separate point around prayer. I've had many clients over the years with whom I couldn't use a word like prayer, or even a term like self-forgiveness. It was a little too far out there. But that doesn't mean that I couldn't find a way to bring in the concepts. And love, absolutely, Gustavo. I try to do that now, actually, with clients, and talk about ways of loving and infusing that into the workplace. And ironically, I think now more than ever, there is room for that. And I often will take, what feels to my system like risks to talk about things like that because it's so important. And even if it's a momentary, look of shock that I get, it's opening a door. Opening the door, opening the heart, as was captured in one of the examples. And it's also a way of creating that space to look, as Vinita said, at the limitations. Because when we're quickly trying to respond to something, or a client is trying to move quickly because they think that's their responsibility, it's incredibly valuable. And I think this is the one example that I really want to share. Going back to the way we started our session today with the beautiful sound of the Tibetan bell. That's a way of asking all of us to take a moment and stop. And what we do with that moment, I think, is where the possibility is. And it reminds me of a phrase from the author and poet Viktor Frankl, who wrote about the Holocaust, among other things. And he used an expression that has stayed with me for decades, which is that between stimulus and response is choice. So often the stimulus might be a question, or it might be an event that we feel a pressure build up that we have to do something about right away. But if we can take that moment of silence, that moment of quiet, that moment to look at our inner client, our inner counselor, our inner guidance, our inner spirit, before we respond, it's in that moment that we have choice. And that's where our clients will have choice if they are open to looking between stimulus and response. And that's such a key moment, because that is the spiritual moment. That's what we, are bringing forward as an offering. Thanks. Let me stop there.
Yeah. So what I hear you saying is between stimulus and response, there's an opportunity to tap into the spiritual level.
Exactly.
And one of my old Aikido teachers used to say, "Move quickly, but never rush," because you're always moving from center. And one thing that you were talking about, Barney, that I want to circle back to, you didn't use this word, but I think of this word often as a coach, and I speak with my colleagues about this often, is what we often will do is, and Angela, you and I have talked about this a lot as well, we'll invite that ultimately, and we'll switch to the last question here for a few minutes, but ultimately we are inviting clients to consider a different space, a different point of view. And in order to, so that we can support them best and that they can support themselves the best. But it's that invitation. Let me switch over to the slide, which I'm going to advance here through some slides, forgive me. To get, oh, excuse me. And this will just touch on nature, roots, here we are again. It's the roots that matter most in leadership. But for this question, how can we best show up as coaches to prepare ourselves to tap the spiritual dimensions so that we can listen to and serve others best, so that we can invite them in? I have a list here, but I want to hear what you have to say, Angela, on this. You've already alluded to much of this. Anything further on this about how we can show up ourselves?
You know, just being completely authentic and accessing our aliveness in gratitude and in service of what we've been given to be with others that we are coaching. A part of me is struggling with this because showing up authentically and with what I mentioned, radical vulnerability, is always my choice. And to not do that is out of integrity. So maybe how we can show up our best is to show up with complete integrity, allowing others to do the same. If we show up duplicitous or hiding, then we can't really help others to show up at their best. I'm reminded of, during the pandemic, a CEO just last month made an announcement to his organization that during the pandemic, we're all going to need, and speaking to his C-suite leaders, to be mindful that people are struggling, and so be a little bit more accommodating of who they are and different ways that we can support them during this difficult time. And that was a great proclamation. And yet, the very next day at a senior leadership meeting, one of the women on his team, her husband was gone for the day. And so she had both childcare and presenting an investment strategy. And the children were making noise, and she was hitting the broom on the roof, and the CEO muted her, and they lost the contribution that she had prepared about their investment strategy. And, working with her, I said, so what are you going to do about that? And if there was a part of me that had not lost my voice in organizations, I probably wouldn't have gone so deeply. But we talked about using this as a leadership teachable moment to go back to the CEO and think about what are the choices that you could have used differently than muting me, silencing me after you made this proclamation because my children were making noise. So to what extent are we out of integrity? We're saying one thing to an organization, but we're acting in a different way. And so making sure that we're coming to each engagement in integrity. I have another experience of a client that shares with me that when she was during her upbringing, she was told by her mother on a regular basis that she was not wanted. Her mother did not want a fourth child. And she said, every time I sit in front of my CEO, I feel like I'm not wanted. And I could have very easily, put this in a development plan and said, okay, we're going to work on this and get your voice back or get your feeling of self-worth intact. I said, we're going to go outside and scream, and I want to know where you feel the pain. And unless I had accessed those times in my life that I had felt that same pain of not being wanted by a boss or an organization, I probably wouldn't have said, scream as loud as you can. And I needed to come from that place of integrity to allow her to find the vibration in her body that would open up the chakras and the energetic vibration to allow her to sit in front of her boss next time and have that throat chakra, that energetic chakra in your throat that sometimes closes because we're working with people out of integrity. So the best way to come into connection is stay with integrity and use yourself as an example. We are the best instruments to help our clients change. When we access the pain and tragedy and the triumphs that we have been through in our own lives, we can help heal others and help them discover more of who they really are.
Beautiful, thank you. Barney, I'd love to hear your thoughts about this question. And before you respond, so we're reserving some time. We'll probably have a solid 20 minutes for Q&A. So if you've got questions, please drop them into, Uchuel, are they dropping it into the chat, or is there a Q&A? Yeah, there's a Q&A. So yeah, use the Q&A and we'll check your questions. So please feel free. So Barney, sir.
Thank you. Before I respond to the specific question, I want to comment on something that Yolanda put in the chat about choosing love. Actually, it is part of the response to the question. You know, choosing love, choosing vulnerability are signs of strength, not signs of weakness. And how often that gets confused. And so choosing into the loving and coming from a place of clarity, to use Angela's word, integrity, where we are experiencing alignment and asking for that from others, is really a very loving thing to do in terms of being forthright and being clear in terms of what we're bringing forward. It really is a beautiful strength that we can bring and demonstrate. And I think the demonstration is really important. Angela mentioned this by way of a story that she just told about a client. But one of the courses that Andrew mentioned that I'm teaching at the moment is called Expressing Leadership Through Myth and Story. And the stories that we tell, the stories that we tell ourselves and the stories that we tell others are incredibly valuable. And we have an opportunity in our own vulnerability to share those stories as a way to motivate people and really ground the points that we're trying to make. So I found that to be incredibly valuable, and people so appreciate when I'm vulnerable and share how I learned a hard lesson in my life through usually a mistake that I made, and they can relate to that. And so the stories are incredibly important, I think. Specifically to your question, Andrew, I think that the question that you posed really contains the seeds of the answer. How can we best show up to tap the spiritual dimension, to listen and to serve others? Well, we've talked about this many times throughout the course of this session, but tapping we need to tap our own spiritual awareness in order to be able to support that and help bring it forward in others. It's often been said in the context of psychotherapy, for example, that the patient can only rise to the level that the therapist has done his or her own work. I believe that's true with coaching as well. The client can only rise to the level that we have done our own inner spiritual work. So our responsibility is to do what we can, to go as far up our soul line as we can, so that we can be most effective with the clients that we work with. The second point I'll make is with regard to listening. Listening is one of the most important and underrated skills, but not in the way that I used to think. What I listen for now is what is not said. And I listen for the limiting beliefs that people may hold unconsciously, the assumptions behind their words. That's where the golden nuggets are.
Mhm.
And if I'm listening for that, I can go forward and use that. And Gustavo, you're right. Who taught us? Nobody taught us. That's part of the problem. Nobody taught us to listen. And
Well, and particularly, I'm sorry, Brian, particularly some of our, what we've been trained to do, if we're engineers or God forbid lawyers like you and I, you listen, it's the written word and only the written word. It's very much that way. But, how do we listen to what's not being said? Because that's where, and how can I, in order for me to really listen, I'm talking about level 3 listening, that deeper listening, I have to be clear. I mean, the windshield has to be clear in order for me to see. So whatever that practice is that I need to do to sort of clear the deck, I've got to do it, or else I'm not really there. Um, and yeah, I'm sorry to
beautifully,
interrupt.
beautifully said. No, no problem at all. And just one final
Mm.
point about service. And everybody in the session agrees with this, at least according to the comments, that that's what it's all about. It's about being of service. If we entered coaching because we thought it was going to be, a good way to make money or, an easy opportunity, it's none of those things. It is really about how we can serve others in order for them to find their purpose and experience themselves more fully, stepping into the fullness of who they are. So when we can come from that place inside that evokes the beingness of leadership that I mentioned earlier, that's the essence of being of service. That's what soul-centered leadership is about. And so when I think about your question, how we can do that, that to me is how we can do that. Thank you.
So right now I see a question in the question panel that I'd love to tee up for my colleagues here. So Angela, maybe you'd like to take a crack at this one. Let me read it. How do you address persons who sometimes experience dissonance between the practices of their religion, or perhaps the practices of the religion they've been raised with or familiar with, and their quest for greater spirituality? For example, a practice of religion might require animal sacrifice or spreading of the religion, but spirituality is the call for healing, inclusion, and acceptance. So how would you support someone who's experiencing that dissonance? Great question, by the way. Angela, do you have some thoughts on that? I bet you do.
It's a very great question. Um, I would need to think about that more carefully. I'm reminded of, and while I don't have the experience of the sacrificial animal um, as an example, um, I'm reminded of a group of people that were Muslims, that are Muslim, that pray 5 times a day, that needed that space of quiet to pray. And there was such dissonance in the organization that um, there was no time to pray. And if we're going to access the very best of leaders and help them reach their potential, certainly organizations should help them um, be mindful of their religion and the religious practice needs, not to schedule meetings every hour, and to be mindful that that hour might be needed to pray. But in addition to that, this group of Muslims needed a place to wash their feet before praying. And they had asked facilities, they had asked HR, they had asked, even taken it to the legal counsel, could we do this? Because there was dissonance in the organization. So sometimes I'm coaching and I'm not just dealing with a one-on-one dissonance, and it's more magnified with the institutional dissonance, and
Mm.
how do they accommodate religion in the organization? And any one of those groups could have decided that the people mattered more, that their potential mattered more, that their contribution mattered more, and given them a place to wash their feet and a place to pray. So I think we're still struggling with that. I don't know that I have an answer to that. I would say come back to a place of integrity. And what is it that we're really trying to get out of the leader that we're coaching or the organization we're serving? And how are you going to get that if there's dissonance between who they are and what you need them to be? I don't come from a place that I really need anyone to sacrifice their religion in order to be an effective leader. So I don't know that that answered your question, but that's what came up for me.
Yeah, no, thank you. And I see, as I reread the question from Kamala looks to me as dissonance between the practices of their religion and the quest for greater spirituality. So in that sense, it sounds like it's an inner conflict, not necessarily a conflict between my practices and the workplace.
Oh, okay.
So that could really be a situation where it's a spiritual journey. And that, Kamala, I mean, that, my friend, that's that's an individual spiritual journey. Yeah, thank you for clarifying. I see the chat message, more of an inner conflict. Yeah, well, there's a lot to talk about here, and I'm sure that any of us would be glad to talk with you about this, and perhaps many of the other coaches on the chat as well. But my only comment about that, Kamala, is stay on it, because if you're being drawn to that quest of spiritual growth, whatever that means for you, and it's different for each person, stay on it. Stay on it. There's nothing more important in my belief system. Barney, anything to add to that? Or you could take the next one.
Well, the only thing that I'll add to that is that if I were, a coach working with this individual, I would remember what you said toward the outset of our session, Andrew, about acceptance being the first law of spirit in many traditions. And I would go out of my way to be non-judgmental and support that individual, because he or she, I think, is going to need to be the one to come into the wholeness of balance with whatever the religion and the spiritual quest bring forward. And let's say that those things are not mutually exclusive, and that it's part of all of our journeys to accept and acknowledge what has brought us to where we are today and choose where we're going tomorrow.
Beautiful. Okay. Angela or Barney, I see there's a couple of other questions in there. Does either one of those jump out to you? I'll give you a second to look at it.
I am not seeing the questions, Andrew. Could you?
Okay. Yeah, it's Q&A on the bottom tab there. But one question here is, coaching could mean conforming to certain requirements, but self-mastery and spirituality is more of an inward and free journey. It's kind of maybe the antithesis to conformance. How do we blend these two? And I think that at times, if I'm understanding the question correctly, there have been times where I'm with a client who is in this space, and I'll ask a question about values or purpose. I'll ask a question about what is your mission? And I have some tools that are very useful in uncovering that, which is, to me, just what our role is to ask the right questions. By the way, much more enjoyable than asking questions as a lawyer, I would mention, but is to ask the right questions, to invoke and invite. And at times, what can come out is something that is very inconvenient, given that we only have 40 minutes before you go back to work or something like that. So honestly, it is something to be balanced. And I think, for many of us, we've had that experience of, oh, I need to plan for the right environment for this. And Angela, you're so wonderful and creative in terms of the spaces for coaching to allow that, so that the environment facilitates that deeper presence. So where can we be sure to allocate time properly? Where do we meet, or even how do we meet if we're not meeting in person? What are the tools that can assist the experience and the conversation? And that could be music, it could be solitude, it could be not solitude, it could be being in a certain place that evokes a certain energy for us, or relaxes us, or stimulates us, whatever it might be. But that question, I think, really comes back to that point of, we need to be thinking and planning and present and ready to offer these different options for the client so that they don't feel that discomfort of trying to conform into this, oh, we only have 17 minutes, tell me about your life's purpose. Not going to work very well. So how can we be deliberate with some level of a forethought so that we can really support the client as well as possible? And in fact, that's what we're modeling for leaders as well. I think every time we coach a leader, we're modeling how they are showing up for their people. So to the extent that we can work with them to help create the proper space for openness and exchange, I'd like to think that they're learning some ways they can do that with their own team members. But it is a good question, though. At times, we're talking about opening up some things that are difficult to put back in the bottle. And how do we do that if the coaching structure is defined and less than fluid? It's a really good question. It's more like a question to be asked and you continue to ask rather than have any specific answer. That's what I would say. Others?
I wonder if we could just say, let's redefine the coaching structure.
Hmm.
I mean, if it is not working, not coming to an engagement with any expectation that it needs to look a certain way.
Beautiful. There's a question that just popped up here a few minutes ago that I think is really juicy for our current societal time, which is how can spirituality help a coach manage his or her biases constructively?
How
I just,
can coaching or
I
how
just,
can spirituality? What is the question, please?
yeah, and I just want to read it and just let it soak in because it's such a rich question. How can spirituality help a coach manage his or her biases constructively?
You know, coaching and spirituality. Well, first, the thought that comes to mind, and Barney, I'm sure you have an answer as well, but is that we are really there in service of whoever is in front of us and whatever it is they need. And so, whatever bias that we may have, it's almost that we come there pure as an open container to allow this other person to have a beautiful experience to soar. And so, whatever bias that is there, and I coach a lot of white men that are probably very biased, and others that are probably very biased. And so, one way is as an open vessel, just allowing myself to hear the bias and for me to acknowledge that, yes, there is bias here in the room, and how are we going to manage this? And creating a teachable moment out of that. And if we don't do that, you know, really call it to the attention that here's the bias I'm having and I need to own it. And how are you with this? Then we've lost that teachable moment. And I would dare say that men that are in the audience as you coach women know that you're sitting in service of people that have been abused and raped and insulted for centuries. And so there is bias already in the room. And for you as men, or even women that are senior to women that are disempowered, for us to come to that without a sense of, I need to figure out what the trauma has been somewhere in the coaching conversation so that I can help empower this person to live in more harmony. And by just talking about the bias that is there in the room, or in the Zoom room, chat room, or in the office, in the engagement, you can create more yin and yang and free up the energy to embrace this person having left with more love and felt loved. So just getting out of my own way sometimes, and I talk about radical vulnerability. If I have a bias, I am going to share what that is. And I'm going to share that I'm going to ask for that by giving it. And so there's nothing that is not part of me that I can't use as an instrument for conversation, as an instrument for change.
Mm. Mhm.
There's to hide that part of ourselves. We're human and we have biases.
Yeah, and so as the question asks, how can spirituality help a coach manage his or her biases? What comes up for me first is, before I can manage my biases, I need to become aware of my biases. And before I can, just in terms of my own process of learning, perhaps this resonates with you, before I can become aware of them, I need to be open, and I need to feel safe enough to ask the question and do the exploration, right? In other words, am I ready to learn? And from my point of view, spiritual practices, whatever they might be, in my experience, can make me feel held enough to ask the question. I'm not going to die. I'm not going to, be consumed by self-hatred or whatever. And if something shows up that I don't want to see, there is sufficient loving support and presence. I am being held. I am safe. I am good. I'm connected. I'm belonging. And when I'm in that space, I'm more willing to see things because I'm not going to be quite as threatened by them. So in that sense, I would say a good spiritual practice, whatever it is, will make me feel grounded enough and willing to see what I need to see. If I'm more centered, I can see things more clearly. I'm more willing to see and more open to see what biases I might have. And then from that place, I can manage them. I might answer it that way. Barney, anything on that?
I'm reading it as the individual opportunity,
Yes,
not
yes.
not vis-a-vis a client necessarily, although I
Yeah.
love the way that you and Angela both answered that. But to me, we all have biases, we all have judgments. That's part of the human condition. And what spirituality allows us to do in that quiet moment of choosing is become aware of them so that they aren't driving our interactions. They aren't driving the conversations that we're having with ourselves and others. Thanks.
Yeah, it's almost like I'm reminded of that beautiful Rumi quotation, right? Out beyond ideas of right and wrong, there's a place, I'll meet you there. A spiritual practice or spiritual activity or spiritual moment, whatever it might be, that's that field. So to the extent that I can get there, or that's one way of describing that field, or one aspect of it, if I can get there, I'm more willing to consider what those biases are. It just brings us to a place of greater openness. I'm feeling as though I want to share this. We have two slides with quotations on them, and I'd love to bring them in that I think are lovely in terms of leadership and service, because we were talking about service. So this one from Nelson Henderson: the true meaning of life is to plant trees under whose shade you do not expect to sit. I think that's what we're here to do. That's the service ethic. And relatedly, or maybe more relevant right now, from Ruth Bader Ginsburg: to make life a little better for people less fortunate than you. That's what I think a meaningful life is. One lives not just for oneself, but for one's community. And to me, it's inspiring and encouraging and inviting to hear that type of a quote and that type of a consciousness from someone who's in a obviously one of the most senior judicial positions in the world. So I appreciate the invitation for me to show up that way, with that as high a level of service and focus on service in what I am fortunate enough to be able to do every day. So any closing thoughts, Angela and Barney? I want to respect everyone's time here. We're getting close to our conclusion.
I do have one, if I can jump in, because there was one more question that we skipped over that I'd like to comment about from Vanita, about how we can reach out instead of waiting for clients to come to us, and what the term used was, how can we create a multiplier effect in today's world? And I had an immediate response to that, which is that while often our engagements are in this sort of one-on-one relationship, we can be coaches in other parts of our lives. It doesn't necessarily need to be restricted to those kinds of engagements. one example that I have is a client who wants to do more coaching, and yet he has a full-time position just below the C-suite.
It's a real job.
Yes, he does. He has a big real job. And what we've been talking about is the fact that in his role, he can still coach his team.
Mhm.
And so he doesn't have to wait. He can have coaching oriented conversations and model the behavior that we've been talking about. Second, in terms of the multiplier effect, I love that. And there are organizations like Coach Aria that give us the opportunity to come together and to, multiply the energy of what we're having. And I think we owe gratitude to Ram for that. Thanks.
Angela, any closing thoughts?
You know, this conversation is so compelling, and I want to thank you for including me in today's conversation. We are called to live our lives in the very best way we can, and so it is a brief moment in time for us to just care for ourselves so that we can care for each other, the people whom we coach, to give gratitude for that opportunity, because it is a call to really create a different humanity, more of humanity, and an affirmation that, like the multiplier effect, the more that we, all of us, are reaching out and coaching and bringing spirit into that conversation, into that workplace, into that coach's spirit, the more that will multiply and allow people to heal and to face their concerns, their trauma, and to come out on the other side um, being stronger, more vibrant, and magnifying their true potential, which is the work that we are here to do.
Mm.
So
Thank you.
I'm really grateful, and on so many levels, I wish all of you the best to bring that spirit and to bring more of yourself into who you are so that you can help other leaders be more of who they came here to be.
Mm. Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you so much, Angela, for being with us. And thank you, Barney, and thank you all. I look forward to reading some more of the chats that I may have missed, and hopefully we can capture those. So bless you all. Take care of yourselves. Take care of each other. We'll see you.
Thank you, Andrew.
Thank you. Thank you so much, all.
Thank you everyone for joining us on behalf of Kucharia. We are grateful that you joined us. Andrew, Barney, Angela, thank you for sharing all the wisdom. I think there was a lot to learn, a lot to reflect upon, a lot to execute. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Yurchwell, for your support.
Thank you.
Most welcome.
Okay. Be well, everyone. Thank you.
Thank
Most
you.
grateful. Thanks.